If you've been watching me for a while, you're probably here because I talk about ROM hacks, especially of Super Mario 64. ROM hacking has come a very long way broadly, and nowhere is that more evident than Super Mario 64 specifically. As a matter of fact, Mario 64 mods actually made up a lot of my favorite gaming experiences in the last few years. The kinds of things that modders have done to this game are absurd at this point, and it just seems to be getting better all the time. I can still remember when something like Last Impact in 2016 seemed impossible, and now, half of the things that made that one so cool to me at the time are kinda taken for granted today. We have not only new levels in music, but also graphical innovations, performance upgrades, and entirely new mechanics and power-ups. Fundamentally, some of these hacks are almost like brand new games altogether. Today, hacking Mario 64 seems to be much more of an established and advanced science than ever before. There are a ton of resources for doing so, tons of communities, information, documentation, and utilities. It's been fully decompiled, there's a PC port, there's a lot to work with. That's not to say ROM hacking is now easy, because it's absolutely not. You still have coding and modeling and animating and everything in between all that, but it's evolved phenomenally to the point that you're not flying blind. There was, of course, a time when there was very little to work with, no roadmaps to follow, where everything had to be figured out from scratch. And that's where today's subject comes in. Super Mario 64, The Missing Stars. This hack is old, it's practically Paleolithic. I actually spoke about this in a video 8 years ago, but I didn't really give it its proper due respect. If anything, I was probably disrespectful towards it. Like most of my ROM hack reviews from back in those days, I wasn't fully conscious of the dynamic of ROM hacking. I held them to the same standard as fully officially released games by big studios, which wasn't fair, considering most of these were usually made by one person or a small group of people. I was way too critical of things that didn't deserve it and too conservative with the praise that they probably did deserve. But that's ancient history now. You see, I've been wanting to revisit a lot of ROM hacks for a long time with the knowledge and experience that I have today. And I've already reevaluated a few like Star Road, Last Impact, and Mario 74. If you know anything about the history of Super Mario 64 mods, you'll know that Missing Stars is just as important as any of those, and if you're not familiar with it, well, let me explain. What is it that makes this ROM hack so special? Well, it's generally accepted that this is the first ever major Mario 64 hack ever made in the modern sense of the word. Released in 2009, it was, to my understanding, the first ROM hack to be comprised of entirely new, fully custom levels that do not exist in the base game. It wasn't the first ROM hack in general ever made, they definitely existed before this, although most of them were modifying the existing content of the vanilla game like Kaizo mods or changing the model to Luigi. There might have been a couple of experimental hacks that served as proof of individual concepts, but something like Missing Stars was unheard of. Today, a fully original Mario 64 ROM hack with all new levels is something that is taken for granted, like of course it has new levels, it's a ROM hack. But that was not the case when Missing Stars came out. You could call it a pioneer of the modern ROM hack in many ways, and it's a ROM hack of a game that's already considered to be a pioneer in many respects. How poetic. There's a pretty nice 36-minute video by Snooplax documenting the history of Mario 64 ROM hacks, which goes into greater detail about this historical context, so if you're interested in that, I'd highly recommend checking it out when you're done here. But in the meantime, I'm gonna take you back to the past to play the Missing Stars that kick ass. Since this game is super old, I'm not gonna worry too much about spoiling stuff for you, so if that's a problem, I would recommend playing the game first because it's not terribly long. And if you do get spoiled, play it anyway. It's an important piece of history. The premise is that the town's power star has been split into pieces and Mario has to hunt them all down so they can rebuild it. It's a simple and straightforward story and is pretty much all the game needs to get you going. It's always interesting to go back through gaming history in the modern context to see all the things that have changed over the years. Yet despite being relatively primitive, there are parts of this game that are actually kind of unique, even today. There are only 2 worlds that operate like a regular Mario 64 level, giving you a mission selection and a little description of whatever challenge lies ahead, but for the rest of the game, you just get dropped into these open sub-areas with no instructions whatsoever. Nothing but a star counter telling you how many stars are left. You got little puzzles to solve and platforming challenges to overcome. It's not supremely difficult on the gameplay end, often relying more on paying attention to the world and reading the dialogue. It's not always a pure platformer as much as a game about exploration. It does show its age at times, but that's entirely acceptable given the accomplishment. The level designs have a distinctly experimental look to them, which makes sense considering this was likely a highly experimental project by nature, but they actually work very well. I never felt an overbearing sense of bugginess while playing. There are some surprising innovations that you wouldn't expect from a game this early. The world has a day-night cycle, which is really neat, and every section of the world actually has different stuff going on depending on the time of day, which encourages you to really pay attention. The game has 38 stars in total, and a single playthrough will go for a little over 2 hours, which is not massive by today's standards, but pretty impressive considering it was the first of its kind. And there's a surprising amount of variety in there as well. One of my favorites is the race with Koopa the Quick, where he runs at light speed and the only way to beat him is to cheat by wall jumping over the wall as soon as the race begins. I don't feel bad about it. He was probably cheating too, somehow. Gameplay-wise, it's fundamentally the same as the original, although there is this really cool part at the end where you face off against Bowser, but instead of throwing him into bombs, you actually get to throw fireballs at him, making for a more aggressive confrontation. That's not something I expected to see in a game this old. And speaking of things you wouldn't expect, you can also play as Luigi. That's right, L is real, for real. Visually, the game is pretty much on par with the original. A lot of the textures and models are repurposed, which is understandable given the context of its development. The music, on the other hand, is mostly new remixes of existing tunes from other games, another thing that's taken for granted today, but not quite as common back then. I don't imagine it was the first, but either way, they sound pretty good for the most part. They're instantaneously recognizable, and some of them I haven't heard elsewhere, even today. In retrospect, I think the most impressive part of this hack is how fun it is. I half expected revisiting this hack to be really painful and frustrating, but it's surprising just how well it did on what could be considered the first try. There are hacks that came out after this one that don't feel this reliable. Granted, they may be trying to do more, but even so, it's a very pleasant surprise to come back to this one and not get burned. This hack has obviously been surpassed in many ways in the years since its release, but considering it was a pioneering game, you have to ask just how much of that would have happened if it hadn't been for missing stars in the first place. Is it possible that ROM hacks would look very different today without this one? Maybe. In any case, it was nice to look back at it after all these years, and I would strongly recommend it if you haven't played it already. And with all of that said, thank you so much for watching my video.
Here we go!